evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I've always seen the building from outside and wondered what it feels like to be inside. It's nice to be in the Goldman Sachs room. So thanks for coming. Like Jonathan said, my name is Anijo Matthew, and most people just call me Anijo. It's a little weird, but it's easy. I teach at the Institute of Design, and some of you have been working with our professors and students at ID, so you're not unfamiliar with the program. But you are unfamiliar with me, so I'm going to give you a little background about what I do at the Institute of Design. I'm an architect by training, so I have a professional architecture degree. I have a design degree and a PhD. I'm finishing up my PhD in computing. So what I do at the Institute is trying to merge the three disciplines. Look at space and technology, and how space is influenced by technology and how technology is influenced by space. That's what my research looks at ID. I'm particularly interested in the conversations that happen between people and people. And this is interesting because that's what we all do. But what's more interesting is the conversations that people have with objects, and as objects get more sentient, I'm starting to get more interested in the conversations that objects have with other objects. And my research, because of its specific nature, looks at these conversations through the lens of technology. So what I do at ID is try to figure out what these conversations look like, what the technologies that mediate these conversations look like, and so on. So that's what we do. Now, you can imagine there's a lot of things that we need to prototype because these things don't exist yet. So that's what this lecture is about. And a few summers ago, Marty Taylor, another professor at ID, and I did some research where we looked at how designers look at prototyping across disciplines, across design firms, academia, industry. And this presentation is partly a result of that research project that we did. It was a long project. We did surveys, interviews, embedded research, user research, and so on. So that sets the tone for the presentation. And I'm going to make this a little bit interactive. So I've been told by Jonathan that you guys will throw tomatoes at me if I'm not good. So I'm going to ask questions just so that I can return the favor back to you. Right? So let's start with the discussion about what is design. Now this is, depending on who you ask this to, this can get you varied levels of answers, right? I mean, so if I asked the set of designers in our school, we would get multiple different answers. Now, here's my favorite definition. My favorite definition is one that was given by Herb Simon. And what he says is design is the process by which someone can take an existing situation and change it into a preferred one. It's a set of actions that this someone would engage in. Now, that's important because what it sets up from the very beginning of the conversation is that design can be done by anyone, right? And in the Institute of Design, we truly believe this because 50% of our student base are non-designers when they come into the program. And from the very founding of the school, we have actually believed in this. And so we help them through this process of developing methods and tools that they can then use to do this set up a set of actions and move an existing situation into a preferred situation. Now, because of this, a designer has a really complicated problem. Now, imagine this designer is my mother who's trying to change out her kitchen through some design. Right? I mean, she's not a designer. She's a housewife. She has a college degree, but nothing related to design. So this designer must envision, evaluate, and communicate something that is to be real. That is to be real, but is not yet so. And this is a complicated issue because you must imagine what this thing is, evaluate it within yourself or within your team, and tell this to somebody else. Imagine the conversation that must have taken place when Steve Jobs walked into the room and said, we're going to take a phone, an internet device, and a music player and put them together. Nobody probably is in his boardroom, you can imagine what Apple's boardroom looks like, would have imagined this in their head. Yet Steve Jobs did, right? I mean, so that's the power of design. You really have to think about these things and evaluate it and communicate it. Now the problem is, it's getting really complicated. Things are getting really complicated out there. Do people recognize the product in the image? Just shout out.
Tablet.
What tablet?
One laptop.
One laptop in China, right? Does anyone can anyone guess what the context is? Where is this? Where do you think this is? India. What's wrong with the picture?
House.
Sorry?
Power?
Yes.
Wi-Fi?
Yes. Well, that's the problem with the one laptop project, right? When Negroponte first imagined the design, he said that you could practically, I don't know if you guys know about this, I mean, you guys probably have read the case study, but he imagined these things being flown over countries like India in a helicopter, drop from the sky, and as soon as it falls up, the kids are able to open it up and use it. You know what the problem is? It's a beautifully designed laptop, which you cannot open first. I don't know if you've ever played with it. It's very tough to open. But the biggest problem with it is power. So Negroponte's solution was a crank wheel. Do you remember this? He had a crank wheel. Can someone show of hands, how many of you used the one laptop? Did you use a crank wheel? No? Have you used it? It doesn't work. It's beautiful. It's white and green, and it looks nothing like the horrible Windows tablets that are out there. But it doesn't work, right? Just because it's beautifully designed doesn't mean that it will work. The problem is exactly what was said. There is no power in India, and more importantly, the tablet costs as much as this family makes in probably a month. What do you think happened to the tablets? They were sold, stolen, kids got mugged. This is what they saw. The problem is that the designers saw computers when the problem was computing, right? And there was no prototyping done of the context. Prototyping was done of the product. Once you have imagined that it's a computer that's a solution, you're prototyping the product, not the contextual, or not the context, or the importance of how it will be used in that particular context. And this is why it's getting really complicated, right? So the fellows are probably familiar, you should be familiar with this process. So I'm not going to explain it. For those of you in this room, we at the design school, for the last 50 years, we've been following a methodological approach where we map out the process along two axes. One axis goes from known to make, and the other axis goes from real to abstract. And we go across the axes, not always in a perfect circle, but cross math. We like to think that prototyping is the glue that keeps these four squares together. Every point in the process, prototyping helps you to move from one level to the other. And it's important to think of it this way, rather than in the traditional sense of the word, traditional sense where prototyping often happens at the end of the design process, at the end of the business thinking process, right? It is a method to validate decisions. It's not a method to think about things from the very beginning. And so what we do at ID is try to imagine what it would be if you were thinking through prototyping rather than validating your decisions. And so, what is prototyping? Well, I'm going to pull on another great person. Tim Brown of Ideal says that prototyping, I keep the water here so that I don't have too much. Tim Brown says that prototyping is a tangible representation of your idea that allows us to explore it, evaluate it, and then push it one step forward. Right? And in this, all three are important, but the most important word is push it forward one step. Because what prototypes do is that they make things tangible, things that are in your head, put it on the table, and it helps you to move one step forward. And that's what prototyping does. Because no design presentation is complete without an image of Steve Jobs. Right? No designer can finish his presentation. But I don't want you to focus on Steve Jobs. I want you to focus on this guy. Name? Johnny Ives. Now, Johnny Ives did something really interesting at Apple, right? He brought in a culture of prototyping. Well, Steve Jobs did, but Johnny Ives built a culture of prototyping. Do you see what's on the table? What's on the table? iPod prototypes, right? And they are in their secret prototyping lab. Only I have this picture, it's on Google, but. But what's interesting about this picture is that look at what Apple does. Apple is perhaps the only company in the world where decisions of what products are to be launched is not decided by their financial mark sheets, right? Products are decided by user experience and what makes sense to users, so prototyping becomes a key element of the thinking process of Apple. Now you must have, if you follow tech blogs, you've seen these. These are prototypes of the iPad. The one that you see over here what the iPad would have looked like if Ives had his way. This is what the iPad eventually looked like, but it's because of technology advancement and things like that. But this is the kind of prototyping that you're familiar with. If you've come from manufacturing, this is what you do always, right? I mean, you think of ideas, you build it out, and you prototype it. And you build out these sort of schematic looks like prototypes. We want to talk about something different. We're going to talk about moving prototypes to the front of the design process. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because prototypes then become a way to think about stuff rather than to validate it, like I said. Anybody recognize the person? Jeff Hawkins, founder of Palm Computing. So when Jeff Hawkins was thinking of the Palm Pilot, this is, I don't think this is the first one, but this is similar to, it's an ancient device. It sort of brought in mobile computing into the world after the failure of the Newton. When he conceived of the Palm Pilot, what he did was, the Palm Pilot did not exist, right? This thing did not exist at that time. Nobody knew what this thing would look like or how it would work. His only requirement was that it should fit into his pocket. So what he did was, let's switch this on. So what he did was, he took a block of wood and then took that block of wood and carved it into the shape that he thought this computer should take and put it into his pocket. Then he would walk up to people and then during the conversations, pull out this block of wood and pull out a stylus that he had also carved out of a block of wood and start simulating an experience while talking to them. Imagine what the financial guy thought when he was looking. But what he was doing is he was exploring the options that he had of form factors, of interaction, of behaviors. He was exploring the behaviors. What would it look like if this block of wood was this big and he had to hold it like this? Versus what would it look like if this block of wood was this big and he had to hold it like this, right? So those behaviors, how would this person react? All of these things were being prototyped. So he was thinking by building these prototypes. Prototypes can also help to learn about your users. Now, we like to think of prototypes way further in the design process, in the synthesis stage. But imagine what prototypes might look like in the user research stage, where you're trying to understand your user. So at ID, we use a word called prototyping. Prototyping is short for provocative prototyping, or provocative prototypes. Provocative prototypes are behavioral prototypes. They are designed to evaluate behaviors, not to evaluate the function of an object, not to evaluate the form of an object, but to evaluate the behavior of a user. So in this case, this student was interested in learning about attitudes towards sustainability among the student population of ID. So what he did was he designed this little contraption, and the contraption had polar bears on a iceberg, and then he rigged it using a spring, And then he had these little tags that he loaded with weights. And then the less sustainable the product, the heavier it would be. So when you picked up, let's say, Clorox to put on there, the polar bears would sink a whole lot. But if you picked up vinegar, they would sink a little bit, right? And so what happened is, he didn't design this as a product. He used it as a way to start conversations. And the provocations that were instigated by this action of someone taking the vacuum cleaner and putting it on top of this led to a conversation, which probably you wouldn't have had if you asked them a question, what kind of cleaning product do you use? Do you see where I'm going with this? So the thinking of polar bears had nothing to do with the interaction that he built later on, but it helped him to evaluate attitudes towards sustainability. In India, we did very similar projects, prototypes, because there was a language barrier between the students and the people they were interviewing. So they would design these games that housewives could play, and then use it by playing those games, they could get to attitudes and biases. So prototypes help you to learn about the user. Prototypes also help you to learn faster by failing early in the process and by failing often early. Instead of failing when the product is in pilot stage, you fail when the product is in a prototype stage. Instead of failing when it's a $500 million investment, you fail when it is a $500,000 investment. That's the difference between prototyping and piloting. So at ID, for example, we did a project with, this is Marty's project, my office mate colleague. He did a project with the Chicago Transportation Authority, CTA. And they, and some of you may be familiar with this, CTA is launching a new BRT service. They've already launched it to, I think, IPA, Jump. When they were designing it, they came to ID to design the interiors of the bus. Traditionally, what they expected was a scale model of the bus with seats. What Marty did was he took a big space we have at ID, took blue tape, marked up the space in the size of the bus, right? So this is the bus. This is the mark that showed it was an articulated bus, so there's an articulation there. And then he took these chairs, regular chairs that you'd find in a school, and made them seats. He took foam core and he built, he and his students built out these are doors, there's a driver's seat, there's a thing where you scan your card. So the CTO officials came in, they come in and they look at this thing and they start whispering to each other. Is this what we are paying them money for? They come in, they sit down, and they have a conversation about the layout. And then as they're talking, one of the officials stands up and he says, what if this chair was positioned like this instead of this? And then all of a sudden, they're having conversations about movement patterns, usage patterns, how people will stand, how people will move through the bus by changing the chairs around, moving it around. And all of this conversation happened because Marty decided to use low fidelity representations of the chair, right? What is interesting about this project is that because it is so badly done, the officials did not have a fear of hurting the designer. So they didn't, in their mind, they said, these people haven't put enough work into this, it's okay for me to break their design. And because of that, they had a very fruitful conversation. So much so that the chief official took out his phone, called up the factory and stopped, what was it, $100 million project?
What was that? Like 50?
$50 million project and said, hold the line, we need to talk about this. And a critical financial decision was made because Marty put together blue tape and chairs. Right? And this is the power of low fidelity prototyping. Now, when people see these prototypes that we build at ID, they say, you're a design school, can't you do better than this? I mean, your students should be able to stick paper together in like line, right? And my response to them is the reason why it's stuck like that is to show people that not a lot of energy has gone into these prototypes. So when they look at it, they say, sure, that's not the way I imagined this, and this is the way, so the conversation changes, right? So you start to get really interesting discussions about this because of the fidelity of it. And you can fail quickly and early as you're doing this. The most important purpose of a prototype is to fail. A prototype that does not fail is not a successful prototype. So you have to keep failing with your prototype so that the final product is better and better every time. With prototyping, you can explore new behaviors. You can start to see things that you never saw that you never imagined while evaluating and envisioning these products, right? So we were doing this interesting exhibition for the city of the Chicago Loop Alliance. It was Art Loop Open. I don't know if anyone remembers this. This was an exhibition that was spread around the city. And you had to go to different places, Macy's and Block 37, to see the art. And you could vote on the art. And so we designed an exhibition in ID. This is art for us. And you could walk in and see our art, and then you could take up your phone, and the tags they were technically capable of, reaching out to the voting system and tagging and all that. But look at the fidelity of representation. Things are not straight. We found this. Somebody decided they didn't have enough tape, so they stuck it off last. And then we would get people come in. People would come in. You might recognize the user. And users would come in and start to say, this is not what I want from this product. So people would take these things, tear them apart, and write on them because they were not beautiful. Right? So what would happen is you would start to see new behaviors start to develop because of this feedback mechanism that prototypes have. So what does prototyping do? Prototyping is a mechanism by which you can build out your idea, make it tangible. And when you take it out of your head and build it out in a tangible form, it becomes a critique or a consensus artifact. So if you're in a team,
how do you prevent from taking in a lot of people's opinions that aren't your target consumer?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
When you do something like that, how do you prevent yourself from adjusting your prototype to based on opinions that aren't maybe your target consumer?
Oh, you're not changing your prototype to, so intuition still plays a role in the design process. It's not like every comment or every opinion is factored into the next prototype. If someone told you that I like this in pink instead of white, you would take a critical discussion. You would have a critical discussion about why that person said pink. What is important about their choice of colors, rather than making it pink the next time. So you would sort of abstract it up one level to say, what is important about that feedback? And what can we take from it? Yeah. So as I was saying, when you make things tangible and put it in front of someone, it becomes a critique or a consensus artifact. In a team, for example, if you made something, you put it in front of your other teammates, that teammate might say, really, this wasn't what I was thinking when you said hot dogs with chicken curry, right? So, but when you think of these things, they have a particular representation in your head. When you make them, they have a completely different representation. And when you put that in front of people, they get to, either say yes, hot dogs with chicken curry is exactly what we should do, or say, not really, we should do something else. And then they make something, then you critique that, and then that's how things move forward. So you use prototyping to build. You can also use prototyping to experience something. So when you do a prototype, you're also sitting in it. You're also using it yourself. You're building out your notions of what this product should be. You're starting to test out your ideas of what you're doing, right? And what happens because of that is you start to get at, when you started the project, you probably started with this idea of meeting unmet needs, and then you start to think, there are certain needs that are unarticulated. how do you get to unarticulated needs? How do you know you have to get to those unarticulated needs if they haven't even been articulated? So when you put these prototypes in front of yourself or in front of your team or in front of users, people are able to say with definite confidence, this is not the height of the chair that I was imagining. Right? I wanted this to be taller. I wanted this to be shorter. So you start to get at very specific articulations of demands and needs and questions. The most important thing that prototypes do is that they are a record of your process. They allow you to go back in time and say, remember that thing that we did with the hot pink? That's what we should pull for this part of the project. Right? So it allows you to go back in time and say, look at a snapshot of your decisions throughout time and say, that's what we want to do. Questions, comments?
Are there certain applications that you find prototyping isn't as valuable, or do you apply it to pretty much any problem that can be solved? Like, for example, I'm trying to apply this to software or some kind of, I don't know, like a workflow within a company. Like, how do I think about? I don't know. I'm just curious if there are applications you found difficult.
We'll get to a section in the presentation where I said we can prototype pretty much everything, and I'll show you a few examples of what you can prototype. But one of the things that my team prototypes at ID is interaction design, application software, and hardware combination. So within software, there's several types of prototype. Right? I mean, you can do wireframing, you can do high fidelity comms, you can do all sorts of things to get to the user experience. Or at the other end, you can start to build very small library-based modules of the program to test out certain hypotheses that you might have in terms of working. So there are two different prototypes. They're called works-like prototypes or looks-like prototypes. So you can have different types of prototypes to test out your hypotheses or your presumptions about certain things, or your conjectures about certain things. Other questions? Yes?
What's the term you use to describe prototyping to explore
Prototyping, provocative prototyping. P-R-O-V-O, typing, T-Y-P-I-N-G. You can Google it. There's actually a couple of papers on it that were part of it. I mean, we worked with some folks from Scandinavia to build out that term. Yes? Chris?
So I just conducted a really small survey among friends asking about certain moments that had happened to them and moments that they had really enjoyed. And what I was hoping to do was sort of analogous to this in that I was hoping to take what they had said and try to tease out why exactly they enjoyed those moments. So I was wondering if that connects to this and if you have any advice for me.
So I'm not sure I understand the context of the project. Mm-hmm. So I think getting a little bit more of the context might help. You can prototype a survey or an experiment if that's what your question is. You can prototype the end result of that survey. So depending on what the context of the project is, we can talk about that also.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so one of the words that I kept using is fidelity, right? Now what is fidelity? There was an experiment, well not an experiment, my colleague Marty, remember he's the one I did this research with, so a lot of the examples are mine and his pulled together. He asked students to make a hinge for a door. So one student was very creative and he designed a hinge out of foam core. Went in all out, made it look beautiful, constructed it to a point where it would work. Another student was really intelligent, went out to Home Depot and bought a hinge. And the third student was like me, didn't have any money, so he took tape, or she took, I don't remember if it was he or she. So she took tape and used it like a hinge. Which one of these do you think worked the best? Home Depot? Foam core. You think the foam core worked? Actually, it did. The foam version didn't work the best. The Home Depot one works the best because it was designed to be a hinge, right? Somebody had put in a lot of energy, R&D and all that. Which do you think was the cheapest? The tape, right? Which do you think was a successful rendering of a hinge? All three of them. Then what did this person who did the foam core, what did he or she achieve out of it? What did the person going out to Home Depot and spending a lot of money to get it achieve out of it? And what did this person achieve out of it? The only difference between the three is what is known as resolution and experience, right? The resolution of the tape is low, so you don't think of it like a hinge. The resolution of the stuff that this person did in foam core is really high, so it looks like a hinge, but it doesn't work like that, right? It didn't work like that. Now, what is happening here is that fidelity is a careful consideration of these two factors, experience and resolution. What must your prototype look like? How much must it work like the real thing? So as a designer, you have to think of these as two dials that you have, right? I mean, you're dialing up resolution or you're dialing down experience or vice versa, depending on where you are in the design process. Early on in the process, you probably want a low fidelity prototype. A low fidelity prototype is very cheap, it's built quickly, it's built off stuff that you find easily, and it's usually used within expert teams, within the team, within expert users, with people with high knowledge of the design that you're doing, right? So if you're designing a building and you made it out of paper and you showed it to someone who has never seen a paper model of a building, you're going to say, this is not a building, right? A medium fidelity prototype, on the other hand, is something that advances one step further, and you show it to expert and novice users outside of the design team. You're starting to step out, but still someone who has knowledge, so maybe a design lead or someone with experience. And a high fidelity prototype is a validation prototype. Then you start to test it out with actual users, novice users. You start to show it to them, it looks like the real thing, it works like the real thing. Everything about it is almost real, you're just making quick decisions at this point. Also, the fidelity of a prototype, what you choose to prototype in this product space, this whole thing, is dependent on what is important to you. So the same product or service might have multiple functionalities, but you might only choose to prototype certain functionalities in high resolution, high fidelity, and certain functionalities in low fidelity. Or you might choose not to prototype one functionality at all because it's not important to you at this stage. Or users have deep familiarity with it. So for example, if you're making a software and one of the functionalities is a print functionality, then you probably don't have to prototype it unless a new way of printing is what you're prototyping. Because people know how to print, people know how to press the print button and get to a printer. So you don't prototype that. You only prototype those functionalities that are important for you at that stage of the design process. Fair?
Can you go back 2 slides? So you're going to touch on this as far as communication goes, and there's a persuasion dimension to this about strategy and getting consensus, whether you're looking and working with people who are going to invest in your venture or whether you work in an organization. And the higher the fidelity, the more likely they think all the decisions have been made and therefore are going to be harder to convince. The lower the fidelity, the more porous and open the concept is for input, and the more likely your stakeholders are to put themselves into it. And so as it then evolves into higher levels of fidelity, they've assumed a sense of ownership of it. So there's a dimension about persuasion that parallels this.
Now, here's the kicker, right? Your experience of what resolution and experience you Your decision of what experience and what resolution you choose to put in your prototypes will determine the feedback that you get. If you show someone a high fidelity prototype, they're going to give you feedback about colors, materials, finishes, which probably you don't want at that stage. So the story is we went to IDEO and we talked to designers there, and they were talking about how this lady was designing a water bottle. And for some chance, something happened and she decided to make the plastic green. She put the bottle out in front of users. She was trying to figure out how they would hold it and what feedback they had about holding it, right? The first user she showed it to said, I don't like the color green, and wouldn't get over the fact that the bottle was the color green. And she showed it to the second user. They said, it's great, but I don't like the color green. And she goes to the third user and she starts, I know you don't like the color green, but can you tell me how you would hold it? Right? But the story illustrates that her choice of putting green as a color led to a lack of feedback, because everybody was stuck on this idea that the color green doesn't go with the bottle, whereas she was trying to figure out holding it. Good? So what are some methods that you can use? So I'm going to quickly go through 3 methods that are my favorite methods for prototyping. One is called Franken prototyping. Franken prototyping, and we love names at IDEO. Franken prototyping is what you think it is. It's built out of this idea that it is a Frankenstein prototype, right? And so you're creating a Frankenstein monster. So the example that I have is, this is IDEO's Diego dental machine. This was the first time someone conceived of a dental surgery machine that looked like a gun that the dentist could then use like this instead of going like this under the teeth, right? And so they came up with this really innovative product, and it's probably one of the fastest selling dental surgery machines, dentist machine, whatever. This is what it looked like at IDEO. It was put together with a film canister, a marker, and a clothespin. And this is all it took to describe the working of the prototype and the schematic of the prototype, right? The idea. And from this, it developed into the Diego product. And this is what Franken prototype is. Franken prototypes are cheap. They're put together through found objects. They're easy to build, because what happens is you take pieces of paper, you take a coaster, and suddenly you're talking about interaction. Or you take markers, you take photographs, and you start talking about relationships on a surface table. Or in this case, I'm sorry you can't see it properly, but in this case what happened is you can mix this with role playing. Because Franken prototypes don't have the resolution you need, you can mix it with role plays. So in this case, one of the students is standing in front of a TV and pressing a remote control, and the cardboard box is the TV, and there's someone behind, if you look, holding a piece of paper that shows what she's saying, and every time she presses a button, so she presses the button, this person shouts out, oh, I see you press the play button, and then the person from behind pulls out a piece of paper and puts it up, right? And it becomes this really interactive, it becomes funny, but it gets to a lot of interesting feedback very early on in the decision making. Post-it notes are great Franken prototyping tools, especially for software, because you can have layers of decisions built into the post-its and then peel off the post-its based on where you are. So if someone makes a decision to go 2 steps down, you can just look up and peel it off, versus someone who makes a decision to go 1 step down. Franken prototypes are useful because they are fast, they are fuzzy, and they are disposable. Nobody cares about these things that you put together. They only have meaning because you put them together in a certain form and fashion. Right? So remember the crazy representations that we had? We just would make these quickly, people would come in, they would say something, we would respond to that, something else would go up, and so on. This is a shopping cart that someone put together. They got a bag from their home and then bought got a lot of plastic bags and described an experience with their shopping cart. A second method you can use is contextual prototyping. Not all of your ideas, especially the ones that D4Lab is working on, will have a product form, because some of these are experiential aspects, right? I mean, you might have experiences or services that you're prototyping. In this case, you need context to describe what you're doing. So this is a way in which you simulate the context in which this experience will take place. This is a project that we did for Memorial Sloan Kettering, which will resonate with the D4 folks. And we were looking at extended care for cancer patients in their homes. And instead of explaining what that looked like, these students designed what might look like a cancer patient's home, and then did role play in the home. So these guys are MSK-CC people who came into Chicago, and the entire context was built out, including a projection that looked like it was a kitchen, right? And then once you have this context built out, you can use it to role play the experience or the service that you might have within that context. So in this case, this is the lady who has had cancer. This is her husband. He comes in. She's doing stuff. He's reading his iPad. It's all choreographed like a narrative skit, but it's all built into the context of use. And every experience that she has in there is carefully designed, although it is built out of really cheap stuff. This is just a painting that they printed and put into these frames. These are things that they found in a thrift store and put together. And these are magnets. And these magnets were reactive. They had RFIDs in them, so they had to show how they would work. So they made these out of Play-Doh and then stuck them on real sort of LED lights. So when they put it on the fridge, they would glow. That's it.
How important is it, from your experience, to have role players that match your target? For example, someone who's actually had cancer, so they have the emotional aspects to, and they've experienced, they're going to walk through it differently than an actor.
It's a good question. In fact, I think with most of the projects that we do a lot of user research up front. So one of the reasons why we do this user research is so that the designers have empathy towards the user. So our hope is that by the time they get into a prototyping stage, they have enough empathy that they can sort of play act their experiences. So you don't really need to have cancer patients there. You just need to show what they're feeling or what they're thinking.
You talked a lot about earlier how the resolution kind of impacts the fidelity in terms of how you might want to have kind of a lower resolution product early on so you get more discussion around that. Can you talk about how the quality of the experience actually kind of impacts it as well? I mean, is this example here, is this kind of a higher quality experience, which therefore makes it less?
Well, think of it this way. If you have two things that you want your audience to figure out, and only one of them is important for them to focus on, you want to make the other one easy to learn so that they can quickly get to the second. So, in this case, they only wanted them to focus on the interactions that the husband and the wife were having in that house, right? And the technologies that they were using to talk. So in this case, they really had to make the other things simple enough for them to understand. So they actually dragged the refrigerator into the space so that it looks like a refrigerator and not build it out of foam core. So then what happened there is that the resolution of the contextual prototype is high, but that's not what they were describing. What they were describing is the experience that's happening within that. In that case, that was a medium fidelity representation. So if you have a service prototype, for example, you might build out the cafe space that this person is standing in to full fidelity because that's standard, but the service experience might not be thought out fully.
In your experience, would there be any benefit to maybe doing this exercise and then taking a focus group and asking them to draw out their experience and then kind of comparing it to what you guys had after?
So we do something similar. The next method is something similar. We actually don't like focus groups because focus groups have other problems that we can't get into today, which is people influence each other and their actions are determined by where the conversation is going. So what we do is we do something called as Wizard of Oz prototyping, which I'll get to in a second, which sort of responds to what you're asking. But yes, you want to get the users into these prototypes also, so that they can give you feedback about how they feel, and so on. Other questions? Yes?
When you're doing a high resolution contextual prototype, you mentioned like a cafe. Can you actually bring somebody into like a cafe and carry out the experience there?
Well, there's a problem. Yes, if you're working with Starbucks and the only thing that you're prototyping is the service, right? And then you can bring Starbucks folks in and into the Starbucks cafe. And I personally wouldn't do it, because what happens is that when they come into that space, they have preset memories of what happens in that space. And these preset memories may not have any relationship to the thing that you're prototyping. So things may be, the person who is the decision maker may have had a bad experience in that particular cafe. So you don't want to take any particular space, you want to simulate that space. Other things? The next method, going to your question, is my favorite, absolute favorite method, and you'll see why. It's called Wizard of Oz prototypes. Everybody knows Wizard of Oz in this room? Yes? Show of hands? Okay, good. So, story is Dorothy goes down the yellow brick road, she gets to this big country called Oz, she meets the wizard has this big bellowing voice, fire coming out of his ears, and I can't remember where all, but there were things coming out of his ears and mouth, and then turns out the wizard was just this old man standing behind a curtain and pulling levers. And this is what a Wizard of Oz prototype. At the front end, the user thinks he or she is seeing a fully flushed out experience. In reality, there is someone behind sitting at a computer or pulling strings to make sure that the prototype is working. So if someone goes up to a touch screen and touches a button, and as soon as they touch the button, fireworks explode, that's not because it has been coded into that interface, it's because someone is sitting behind on a laptop and they have the mechanism to see what this person is touching, and as soon as this person touches the button, this person goes to slide number 2, which has fireworks. Right? The whole thing is built out in PowerPoint. And what would have taken months of coding or weeks of coding now takes 5 minutes, because you just take a ringmaster clipart and put it into PowerPoint. Right? Well, hopefully you don't know that. But that's technically what you would do. And look at what's happening. Now you're playing with experience and resolution. To the front end person, it looks like it's a high resolution prototype. But in reality, the resolution is only a pretense. And the fidelity is based on this person's memories rather than real technology. Right? This was first done at IBM, where they were experimenting with the talking computer in the 1960s. And this is a really cool experiment that they did. Instead of building out the computer, the speech recognition system, what they had was a really fast typist at the back. And when this person talked into the mic, this typist could hear it in the speaker, and this person would quickly type it out. And in the front, this person saw the user saw his speech becoming text. So good was this prototype that IBM officials came, played with it, and said, "Let's go to market." Right? And then John Conte, the team leader, said, "Let me tell you something." Right? And that's what happened. This is how powerful it is. We did a similar thing, this is my favorite video to show, because it really threw people off. This was a group that wanted to install a laser hub in the middle of Chicago on one of those. If you're from Chicago, if you've been to the town, you can see on State Street are these harp-shaped L metro station, so they wanted to put a laser hub there. So, but they wanted to test out what would happen if you put something like that on the street. So instead of building this out in real, they made a Wizard of Oz prototype. And they would invite people to use it. Now remember what's happening. It's a low fidelity prototype, so it's a code track with some strings. Now, in this picture you can see people using it. Now, keep this person in mind and see what he has in his hand, right? I'm going to show you a video.
What is going on in the hallway?
My prototype.
Oh, that's good.
You said you was going to just one thing.
That's awesome.
What? You said that this thing.
That thing?
Oh, people are using it.
I believe it.
He can't tell you. So you asked if it's Arduino. It's a microcontroller device if you make such
It is
projects.
awesome.
Do something. You get the idea. I'm going to take it out into the street.
What makes this possible? That's a little delay though.
Yeah, we're working on it.
So what do you think was happening? This guy that I told you to focus on downloaded a $5 heart application on his iPad. You remember those speakers that were on top of the kiosk? Bluetooth speakers connected to the heart on his iPad. So as Hugh walked up and did this, all he was doing is pop, 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 pop. He's doing this on his iPad. To Hugh, it looks like he is strumming the strings, right? This is what a Wizard of Oz prototype is. To Hugh, it looked like this complex technology. In fact, the lady who you saw next to Hugh was so enamored by it. After Hugh left, I don't know if you were there for this, she went around, she looked under the table, where is the computer? How is this thing working? And she really wanted to finally we had to tell her that, look, they were trying to. And what they did is, they had this little thing here that looked like it was a camera recording or there was a technology artifact, and this person was just taking notes on his iPad. But in reality, he was playing the part. And this is what a Wizard of Oz prototype does. Cool?
Yeah.
So what can you prototype? Going back to this question of what can you prototype, right? Well, technically, I like to think that you can prototype everything. People are very good. We have lots of examples of people prototyping products, services, messages, and interactions. That's most commonly what's prototyped. But you can also prototype businesses, business models, sales strategies. Take, for example, SC Johnson. SC Johnson has a new product out there, Vecco. Are you guys familiar with this product? It's a do-it-yourself carpet maker. So you take blank canvases of carpets, and then you spray this product, and you get, your carpet made. Interesting concept. SC Johnson has never had a retail store in their existence before. And they wanted to test out, because this is such a complex experience in terms of what users would do and how they would get their carpet, They couldn't pass it on to Lowe's or Home Depot. So they prototyped an entire store around this. So they took a store in Chicago, built out that model, got people in, and they would sell the products there. But it was a prototype for them to test out if they can get into retail strategy rather than pass it on to Home Depot. There's another product in India called Chotocool. Have you guys heard of this? Chotocool is a refrigerator that this company called Godrej made for the BOP market, the bottom of the pyramid market in India. It's a cooling device. One of the problems in India, for those of you who are from India or have familiarity with the country, is the last mile is a big problem. Getting the product to the user is very difficult. So what did these guys do? They prototyped a new delivery mechanism in which they tied up with the post office, and a postman in India has so much reach that they go into every village, they know each person in the village because they deliver letters, they have conversations in villages. So they prototyped a mechanism by which postmen or post folks could get a commission for selling Chotocool to villages. And so what they did was they took one state and they worked with the Postmaster General of India and built out an entire delivery strategy built on the mechanism of the post office. What's interesting about this is the statistics. The company Godrej, a $3 billion company in India, it's pretty big, went from 0 to 600 centers, retail centers in 60 years, and from 600 to I think 100,000 retail centers, 100,000 post offices in 1 year. Imagine the scale that they're working at, right? So this is what you can do. You can prototype different things. You don't have to prototype products and experiences. You can prototype sales strategies. And the line that I want to leave you with is that there are no products. There are only prototypes. Think about how many of you got the first iPhone? You remember how it felt? It was a prototype for the 3G. 3G was a prototype for 3GS, and 3GS was a prototype for 4, and so on. Every product is only a prototype for its next iteration. Okay? Thanks. Some more questions, comments, thoughts?
When do you tell yourself to stop prototyping in the prototyping stage?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
When do you tell yourself to stop prototyping in the prototyping stage?
When do you tie stuff?
When do you tell yourself to stop prototyping?
Oh, well, at a certain level, designing has to stop, right? I mean, you have to move to the next step. I would say prototyping itself, the process of prototyping never ends, but what you prototype changes. So you might move from a product to a manufacturing strategy, to a sales strategy, to a distribution strategy, but you're still prototyping throughout. But you stop the product at a point where you can say, this is it, we're going to market now, and so on. Other questions?
Have you ever encountered someone who was resistant to these techniques, and how did you get them on board?
Well, most big organizations are resistant to prototyping because prototyping by itself does not deliver results. They deliver failures. In fact, in companies and in organizational structures, there are no rewards or incentives built for failures, so prototypes are not a cultural experience that they are familiar with. For example, I had a student who worked with Best Buy, and Best Buy wanted a new retail experience that they were building on. And they paid a lot of money for this, but they wouldn't pay anything for prototyping because they didn't think that prototyping got them anything. So in fact, you would, if you went out into organizations, most organizations, especially manufacturing organizations that are built out of the Industrial Revolution, where prototypes or validation methodologies, they actually find it very difficult. It's very difficult for you to convince them to do prototypes.
And so do you Is it generally people self-select and you just work with people who are?
So usually what happens is we have found that there are certain people who are passionate about this idea and they say, irrespective of what the organization does, we want you to do prototyping. You can allocate the money any way you want. We will just give you that money. Or the other way you do it is to do a guerrilla mechanism by which you prototype anyway, and then as you're prototyping, they start to see the benefits of it. And then they say, hey, this is really interesting. We should do more of this. And then they give you more money or put in more resources into it. One of the statements that get people thinking is the statement about learning faster by failing early, and saying, when you go to pilot, you have to invest 500 million versus you can invest 500,000 now and do a prototype. And that gets people thinking about this.
A lot of your examples seems like there was a large component of co-located teams. Do you have any guidance for distributed teams and how to approach the different frameworks?
That's a very good question. We have actually not cracked that yet. It's a very difficult thing to do, especially if you have experiential prototypes. Experiential prototypes demand a co-located sort of co-experience aspect to it. We are doing a project this summer to test this out. So, I can't tell you more details, but maybe next time I have a little more information. So, honest truth, I don't know.
When you're designing a prototype, say for a service or experience, well, you might want to keep the resolution low. Do you also want to keep components of the actual sort of the experience or the behavior itself low as well when you start out?
Well, it depends on which level of the design, at what stage of the design process you're on. So for example, if you're early on in the process and you're building out a new service model for, let's say, how a patient experience might be at the front end of the process, you might not know all the aspects or the attitudes or the biases of the users yet. So you want to keep the resolution, the experience low, so that you get more feedback from users. So my cheesy example, and you'll understand why it's cheesy, is I don't know if you guys have ever marinated tofu. Yes? The way you marinate tofu is to squeeze all the water out of it, right? When you squeeze all the water out of it, you get enough pores in there to get the marinade into the tofu. So think of it as cheesy, remember? That's what you're doing with these prototypes. You're putting in enough holes into the prototype that users can fill it with information. Now, as you go higher and higher, further and further in your design process, your tofu gets more and more firm. I'm sorry, I had. Someone else had a question?
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on what the composition of the design team should be in terms of expertise and experience.
Has Vijay talked about it? So one of our professors has done lots of research, and he has a book out actually called 101 Design Methods. And one of the things he says that every design team should be a composite representation of what your feature sets are of the product. So if you have users, you want to have some social scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, ethnographers in there. If you have a technology product, you should have programmers or computer scientists in there. If you have a mechanical product, you want to have. So you want your team to be a composite representation of what your product experience might look like. So actually, Vijay is a better person. You can speak to this also. You have led some teams as well.
I think that was very well said.
When I've had to do prototypes, usually with not co-located teams working in different locations, and they're usually business stakeholders. One of the good tricks was to make the line deliberately jagged.
Yeah.
And the content, you can try using lorem ipsum, which is a mock text, but not many people understand it as mock text, so they're asking, what language is this? So what you actually put is, this is mock text. And then, so you deliberately illustrate it, and then you walk them through the entire process over the phone.
Right. Now, lorem ipsum is a good example of increasing the resolution of your prototype too early in the design process. What happens, I don't know, are you familiar with lorem ipsum? It's a technique that graphic designers use to represent mock text in text boxes. Now, when you show this to actual users, they think that their field is going to be populated by lorem ipsum as soon as they get the interface. Right, right. So you sketch it out rather than you making it in as a design. That's actually very true. Yes?
If you could redesign any product or service, what would you redesign?
What would I redesign? Well, the airline experience.
Please do it.
We actually had Kim, who's going to speak next week, talk about the new American logo shift, I mean the livery change. And what she said to Fast Company was, all this is great, but I hope they change their experience. That's what's killing them, not their logo. Yeah, so my personal pet peeve is the airline.
So maybe that balance between a company that might be very concerned about its brand image and with how it exposes prototyping to users, have you sort of seen that trade-off?
Oh, American is a good example. American, I think this was one of our teams that did a study at O'Hare, and they interviewed American executives, and they asked them why they thought their experience, airplane experience, was so bad, and their immediate response was, "It's not bad." And these are people who get out of their office, walk down the steps, get into a limo, come all the way up to the stairwell, go up the stairwell into the connector, and go into the first class cabin of the plane. They have absolutely no experience with what people go through. One thing is to take them through the experience as an economy passenger would go through, but you're never going to get them to do that. The other thing is to get them, invite them into a space that they're not familiar with and have them go through that experience. All of a sudden, that's a project experience, which then they can say, wow, I didn't know this was what our users go through. Because they're never going to go into the airport and go through that. Does that help?
A little bit, yeah. Okay.
But maybe we can talk later.
Thank you.
So prototyping could have figuring out how people feel like immediate reaction,
Yeah.
like short-term reaction, like there are products that are depend on a long-term experience.
Right.
So how to prototype?
So some of our prototypes actually stay up for 3 months. So some of the projects, we are actually doing a project with the city of Chicago now. The Chicago Architecture Foundation, where our prototype is going to stay up for 1 year. So you can get long-term evaluation of the prototype. So in one of the projects that I did, I put a camera up there, and I told people that they were being recorded, so I could understand behavior from a top-down perspective. So you can do lots of tricks for long-term evaluation. But the immediate reactions are also very important, because that's what gives you quick feedback that allows you to make quick changes. Think of, we were just talking about this, think of how timelines for product launches work. You don't have the luxury of doing 3-month evaluations. You have to do things in parallel. And sometimes quick prototypes are all you can afford.
Someone over there.
One of the things that you brought up was talking about doing prototypes and involving your investors in the process. How do you recommend approaching that? Because I mean, obviously, it's kind of a delicate. You want to show that it's working, but you want them to personally feel part of the process as well.
Well, my personal take on this is, if you are trying to communicate an idea, you're at the stage of communication, then you really want to show the high fidelity prototype. But if you're at the stage of evaluation, you really don't want to show them the high fidelity prototype. Because what happens at that stage is their mindset is, this person has only been working at this for 2 months, how can everything be decided yet? And then when they come in and they see a high fidelity prototype, they're already thinking something's wrong here. So by purposefully reducing the fidelity of the prototype, you actually got their attention. Yes?
When you're doing the Wizard of Oz testing and you have to decide, you're trying to decide between like 2 prototypes or maybe 2 different packaging options, should you put the same testers through the same experience twice, or do they only just get 1 experience get their feedback, and then you try the experience with different testers.
Well, most people don't know it's Wizard of Oz. You don't want to let them know it's Wizard of Oz. You want them to think it's a real prototype. In which case, you can have users go through the same cycle twice. Now, you might tell them it's Wizard of Oz at the end of it, or by the end of 2 of those testing periods, but at the beginning, you don't want to tell them. In fact, a lot of our Wizard of Oz users don't know that it's Wizard of Oz. That's the beauty of it. That help?
It does, but what if you can't pull off where they don't know that they're being tested? What if, like...
It's not a good Wizard of Oz prototype. Because the whole idea of a Wizard of Oz is that until you have a catalyst, so you saw the lady, she figured out that the tone was off, there was a delay, and then we had professional harpists come up to us and say, you guys haven't tuned this. Right? And then, so we had things like that. So then we had to tell them, until you have catalysts that sort of signify that it's a Wizard of Oz, you really don't want to let them know. You have a question?
No. It's a question for you, Tim. One of the things that you mentioned was like immediate feedback being an important thing of this. But it seems that like in a lot of cases, people might come with preconceptions of how a question should work and just basically be acting out this isn't what I'm used to.
Yeah.
I mean, what are some ways of getting around that?
So one of the things that we do is we make them purposefully uncomfortable in the testing process. So when we get reviewers for our prototypes, and if it is a presentation style, like you were saying, sometimes we don't let them sit. We make them stand. So that we have broken an expectation that they might have of what they would come into. And once you've broken one expectation, they don't know if the next one is a broken expectation or a real one. So you set this thing in motion by which you, like for example, one thing looks real and it was not real, and then the next one looks real and it is real, so then they really don't know what to do. So you really want to break their preconceived notions of what is known as aesthetics. Well, in philosophy, it's known as aesthetics. Our understanding of an aesthetic is built on our experiences. So you want to break that aesthetic notion.
How do you approach framing the prototyping exercise for the users, and how much sort of preface and setting things up
Right.
is useful versus
Well, again, it depends on what level of your design process you're in. So at an early stage, you would explain to them that this is a prototype and that we haven't finalized all the decisions and we want your help to finalize. At a later stage, when the prototype is at a considerably high fidelity, you don't tell them that it's a prototype. You tell them it's a product or a service that they will experience. So you set the tone from the very beginning. Because if you don't set the tone, then they think, for example, if you showed them a paper prototype of an interface, they might think that that's how it's going to be represented. So you want to set the tone almost immediately. This is a prototype. We haven't made all the decisions we want to offer.
Well, I want to thank Anijo. Thanks so much for the presentation. Really helpful workshop for us all. Certainly, if you guys are doing anything in the Introduction Challenge, and especially our fellows, this is immensely important stuff that we really don't give you an opportunity to learn. So take advantage of having him in the class for 3 more minutes. If the fellows have a couple more minutes, we'll stick around too and just quickly chat. And then next week, we'll see you on Thursday. All right.
So I just have one for the fellows. I mean, another way to think about prototypes is this experience that we've been going through is a prototype. We put it out there as an experience, but what we're doing is we're getting feedback from you as to, is this the way it should go? And you know, to Anijo's point, there are no products. Also, there are no experiences, only prototypes as well. So your reflection and input makes it better for what the next iteration will be as well.
Well said.
All right, thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks, guys. You were great.